So when contemplating what I was going to say, I wondered why. Why are we interested in the origins and evolutionary history of the honeybee? And I guess part of that interest is just because they're fascinating organisms, honeybees. We're all interested in bees and beekeeping. But secondly, hopefully, it'll give us some insight, or understand the evolutionary origins of honeybees might give us some insight into maybe genes that underpin important traits. Secondly, I want to say a few words about how about the origins of honeybees, or the origins of anything. And the evidence that we have, and the evidence I'm going to present, relates to, first of all, fossils on one side. Secondly, DNA sequence data and DNA frequencies of alleles and such like. And that has come on in leaps and bounds over the last few years. So we have genomes of the honeybee and a whole range of other organisms. And thirdly, I'll say a few words about experiments that can also help us understand something about evolution. And there I'll say something about my own, some of my own work. So, contemplating this lecture, the origins, why are we interested in the origins? Well, I thought, here's a good example. We're interested in ourselves, aren't we? And if I say to you, actually, our last common ancestor with the chimp was 5 million years ago, maybe it's of some interest to us. Secondly, we can say we share something like 99% of our genome in common with the chimpanzee. That relates to, or that equates with about 20 million differences in the DNA, in the base sequences, between chimp and us. So 20 million differences have arisen over the last 5 million years. And maybe there's a nice comparison to make there. We can go a bit further with the humans because there's been an awful lot of DNA sequencing undertaken with humans. And based on fossils and DNA sequences of complete genomes, not just of one but of multiple humans, we have placed together, or over the years, scientists have put together a pattern of spread of humans out of Africa. It's very clear, modern humans, we originated in Africa. And maybe 100 or so thousand years ago, there has been a spread of modern humans, Homo sapiens, us, out of Africa. These numbers here relate to when it is thought that modern humans first arrived in particular locations. You'll notice into Europe, and I'm of European ancestry, it's about 40,000 years ago, into a location where Neanderthals formerly used to exist and coexisted with modern humans, or Cro-Magnon. Now, I'll go a little bit further with humans because, I think it reveals the power of sequencing and genome sequences. Colleagues just down the road from me, I'm at Halle University near Berlin, southwest of Berlin, and about 50 kilometers away is Leipzig, another big city. At the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, they've sequenced not only human, but also Neanderthal. And so they have the complete sequence of Neanderthal, as far as is possible. And from those DNA sequences, what we can see is that we shared a common ancestor, our last common ancestor with Neanderthal, about 1/3 of a million years ago, about 350 million years ago. And now I'll look around at the males in front of us of European ancestry, and I'll say, actually, what those analyses have shown is that we of European descent contain about 2 to 3% Neanderthal DNA. Ah, says the wife, that explains a lot. However, to get your own back, If the males contain 2 to 3% Neanderthal DNA, so do the females of European descent. And it's interesting, it's only Europeans that contain that DNA, because sequencing of, and you can see why that's the case, modern humans arose in Africa, spread out. Only in Europe did they interact with, and there must have been some interbreeding with, that means, with Neanderthals. Those peoples, modern humans of Asiatic descent or those of African descent, had no contact with Neanderthals, and there is no trace of any Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. So, this is a small example to highlight the power of DNA sequencing that has also been put to the honeybee to understand something of the history of the honeybee. Now, before taking a purely genetic point of view, I'd like to stress it's not only genes that determine behavior. So you have this view of Neanderthal, probably, the brute there, who is meat-eating and of limited mental capacity, probably. Well, we don't really know. Let me say, though, that just last week an article came out addressing Neanderthal remains in France from about 40,000 years ago, pre-modern human, in which it was found where very sophisticated bone tools were found. So clearly they had the capacity to shape leather and probably quite a rich culture. Now, this doesn't draw a parallel here with nature versus nurture, but the DNA sequences force us to think about the nature component, the genetic component to differences. But throughout, I'm going to state again and again, what we see as a phenotype is not just a product of nature and genes, but also of nurture, the environment. To what extent Homo sapiens, modern humans, and Neanderthal interacted is not clear. There could well have been quite some interaction and cultural exchange, as well as those 2 to 3% of the DNA. I spent too long talking about humans. Let's get back to bees and the evolutionary history of bees, and the evolutionary history of the honeybee. Well, what is a bee? I think you're all familiar with bees and honeybees. What defines a bee? And I'm going to take you back to the origins of bees here. The answer is an insect which contains branched or plumose hairs. And hopefully you can see here on this photograph of the thorax of the bee. It is covered in hairs which are branched, highly branched, and it makes it look furry. And that's because bees are adapted for collecting pollen. And this is one of the species that I used to study in Northern Ireland, Colitis floralis. There's the yellow pollen that it's collected. Here are pollen grains, greatly magnified, and they are much easier to capture in branched hairs. So therefore, bees have evolved branched hairs, and all bees have these branched hairs. What can we say about the evolutionary history of bees? This is going to take you, isn't it? I'm sure. I'm going to show a few of these. I'm going to have to show a few of these because if I want to explain to you something about the evolutionary history, I have to show these so-called phylogenies. I don't expect you to read the little letters. I can't read the little letters. Look at the colours. But what this is a phylogeny based on this is a colleague of mine, Brian Danforth at Cornell University, and we've been working close together for some time. Brian's specifically interested in phylogenies, and what he's done here is to analyse all these little black things are the names of species. He's genotyped, in this case he's got sequences, not complete genome sequences, but he's sequenced certain genes of all these individuals here, which belong to different families of bee. And then he's used a statistical program to assemble them together to show genetic similarities. I'll say that only. So that at the tips up here to the right are those species. And the connections to amongst species go back to the left, the branches. So therefore, the further back you go, the further back is the ancestral connection. So we have here all the bees. At the base here, is the first bee. Out here is an outgroup, some wasps and other insects. So what he's got here is a phylogeny of the bees. So hopefully you'll be able to interpret it in terms of, oh, here are the little branches, here are all my species, and here are their connections with one another. And the thing to note about this, it's a representative sample of all the bees. We've got the honeybee here, which is brown, and I've tried to label that brown like these are brown, because the honeybee is in here. So what we can see is the honeybee is not the most derived and most recent of bee species, far from it. In fact, back here we think is the origin of bees, so when branched hairs first arose. And the original bees were probably similar to this group of bees. This is a Dasypoda. And it's a bee that's found, a species which are found principally in South America, South Africa. There are one or two species in Europe. This species actually is quite widespread. You can get it around here, around London, Dasypoda hirtipes. But they're rather large, very furry bees that nest in the ground, often in deserts. And probably bees arose, or the first bee, the Ur-bee, the original bee, the proto-bee, was something similar to this, like a dinosaur bee, nesting in the ground, rather large and furry, and solitary. From that, we have the origins of, we have a great diversity of bee species. It's thought to be 20,000 species or so. This lineage here includes the honeybee and leafcutter bees. They diverged off fairly recent. So in terms of, so the honeybee is down here somewhere. So in terms of history, you could say, well, actually, the honeybee is a bit of a dinosaur then. It's one of the ancient bees, if you like, one of the earliest lineages of bees, relatively early. The most derived groups are these solitary bees, Andrena and sweat bees that I study often, and Caletes. These are the most derived groups. The Caletes bees, like the one I showed you in Northern Ireland, they are the most recent of bee species. Yeah. So there we've got the honeybee, at least placed in this phylogeny. This is what, 2006, some way back. And Brian recently, I think just a couple of weeks ago actually, has got another paper out. Again, it's similar to the previous one, but in this case, he's gone beyond just putting a phylogeny together. He's tried to date it, to put dates when these things first arose, using fossil record combined with DNA sequence data and a lot more sequence data. And here you can see the honeybee down here, and I apologise, they've changed colours. I don't know why it's changed. Anyway, red down here, we've got the honeybee. The topology of the tree is the same as the previous one. We've got Dasypoda back at very basal down there. And so the honeybee around here. And too small, but we've got millions of years here, back to about 140 million years. I'll summarise that phylogeny here, where you can see millions of years before present. What the phylogenies and the fossils suggest is that bees arose about 150, 160 million years ago. The honeybees are in the Apidae, and they're about 120 or so million years ago. So there we've got a good idea of how long the honeybee, or at least the ancestor of what we would have called honeybee, was around, or Apidae would have been around. And this is about the same time, which you understand, as when modern flowering plants arose, eudicots. And of course, bees, like butterflies as well, bees arose and then in conjunction with flowering plants. And this is the Cretaceous, and it would have looked something like that. It doesn't look very attractive to me, actually, and I don't see many flowers either. Certainly it's a habitat which is dominated by gymnosperms, ferns and such like, but there would have been a lot. It would have been the time when flowering plants first arose and were diversifying. And at that time, when these brutes were running around, well before Homo sapiens or Neanderthal man, that would have been when bees first arose as well, and diversified quite considerably. So that's the origins of bees and placing honeybees. So we've got honeybees about 120 million years ago. But one of the features of honeybees which is really fascinating, not only that we keep them and we enjoy beekeeping, but one reason why we keep them and we're able to use them is because there's lots of them living together and they can produce honey. So it's their sociality which is also really interesting. And they are indeed highly cooperative. There we've got a honeybee nest. This is one of Tom Seeley's James Gould's photographs. Inside an old apple tree, there we've got the combs with the honeybee workers in the middle. The workers, as we all know, are highly cooperative within the nest. They feed one another. The queen lays all the eggs, generally. And the workers even commit suicide in defending their colony. So they are altruistic. From an evolutionary point of view, something of an enigma. Workers will die for their own colony without reproducing. Honeybee and many other bee species are termed eusocial, meaning truly social, because they fulfill these criteria. They show this division of labour. Some individuals reproduce. In the case of the honeybee, it's just the queen. The workers do not. They cooperate in looking after the brood, and there's several generations living together. And I think you're all very familiar with that as beekeepers. Now, that's fascinating, eusociality. Fascinating on a couple of grounds. Firstly, there's some parallels with human society. I think that's probably East Coast somewhere. I guess I don't know where it is. Anyway, it's we have parallels between insect societies and human societies, but not only that, also from the evolutionary point of view, the mere existence of these eusocial societies has fascinated biologists. Charles Darwin, probably the most famous of evolutionary biologists, in his book, The Origin of Species Through Natural Selection, paraphrasing, wrote, and I will now paraphrase again, just the presence for him of social insects, he was describing ants here, was the major critical point that would break his whole theory of evolution by natural selection. So it's just to put across to you how important social insects are for evolutionary biologists. How can they evolve eusociality, which entails individuals foregoing reproduction? When we imagine, and as is the case, that animals, individuals tend to maximize the numbers of offspring that they produce. Or they're selected to maximize their fitness. How can they do that if they are not reproducing? So let's just make it clear what I'm addressing here and what I'm trying to address, which the honeybee must have addressed at some point. How do we go from solitary, and some 90% of bee species are solitary, through to eusocial, like in the honeybee? This is a major evolutionary transition, so-called. How has that happened? And how has it happened in honeybees? Well, falling back onto Brian Danforth's and colleagues, one of his students, Sophie Cardinal's Phylogenies, we've got here a date across the bottom in millions of years. We've got the origins of bees about 150 million years ago. We've got the origins of Apis, or the Apidae, about 120 million years ago. And the origins of sociality in the bees, originally they're all solitary, is placed about 60 to 80 million years ago. Okay? So at some point about 60 to 80 million years ago, they've gone from being solitary across to being eusocial. And in the case of honeybee, it's not looked back. It's very difficult to study that, to understand what's going on there, because it happened so long ago. And in modern honeybees, we don't have any related species which are maybe halfway there or maybe have reverted back to solitary behaviour. They're all highly eusocial. However, amongst the bees, which are green in here, we've got other groups which have also evolved eusociality, and more recently. And the ones that I've been studying, and I'm going to say a few words about experiments now that I've been undertaking, with sweat bees, have evolved eusociality about 25 million years ago. So far more recent. And although it would be nice to work with honeybees and understand this transition from solitary to social. It's just not possible because they're all eusocial and highly eusocial. So therefore, to understand the general principles, how do you go from solitary to social, I focused very much on sweat bees, and that's why it's not because I like sweat bees, it's because they're useful models for understanding that evolution of eusociality. I'll just say now, there aren't many species which are eusocial. We've only got about a few thousand species in the world which are eusocial, of about 1 million or so described animal species. So it hasn't occurred very often, but it has occurred 4 times in the bees. Once in the honeybees, the group reading to honeybees and stingless bees, once elsewhere in the same group, and then twice in the sweat bees, the Halictidae. And as I've said to you, it's a relatively recent origin. And I'm going to put that again in this, I'm going to raise this again, this idea of nature versus nurture. Because probably we've got the view, well, it's all in the genes, it's all nature. And I'm going to stress again, it's probably partly nature, genes, and probably partly nurture, environment. And I've gone to test this, I've tried to test this within a sweat bee species. Now, I think I ought to say something about philosophy as well, and humans. And there's some parallels there, nature-nurture, in our understanding of human society. So there may be analogies. Plato, for example, in his Socratic treatise, The Republic, spoke about a vision of society, or his view of society then being highly ordered and structured. And I'll juxtapose that with another person's view of society, that of Nietzsche. And you might say, well, why am I bringing out Nietzsche? Well, actually, he went to school just down the road from Halle in a place called Schulpforta. And although it was 150 odd years ago, at least is relatively local to where I am now. Nietzsche's view, rather, was that the environment shaped how we thought and how we behaved. More provocatively, it's to do with the role of Christianity in suppressing the health of modern humans. But anyway, for that reason, he didn't get a chair at a German university. But that's something aside. Nonetheless, it juxtaposes these two views. I'm contrasting them greatly into maybe forcing a contrast here between the deterministic and the more environmental views that we see in human society, or the views of how human society is organised. So let's get back to the bees again then, and away from humans. I'm looking down here at these bees, or I have been looking at them. Here are 4 representative samples. They show a wide range of social behaviours, from solitary through to eusocial. And nice detailed phylogenies allow us to trace where eusociality has evolved. And you'll notice this is, again, one of these phylogenies, so excuse it. You're not supposed to read the letters, just to appreciate the shape of the tree, which is in black, the eusocial lineages. So what we can see here is, eusociality in this group, Halictus, has evolved once, about 25 million years ago, and all these species, because these are the species at the tips, at the right of the tips, all these species are eusocial. Oh, except a few that have become solitary again, or that show both behaviours, solitary and eusocial. So they are really interesting to understand that transition from solitary to eusocial, which is why I've worked on, which is why I address them, and why I can't use honeybees for such works, for such a study. So multiple recent losses of eusociality, and one species in particular that we're working on, it goes by the name of Halictus rubicundus. It's relatively widespread in southern England, where it is eusocial. I'd be happy to note. Whereas up in Northern Ireland, where are the Northern Ireland contingent? It's solitary. Yeah. So, and we've been interested in addressing this issue, nature versus nurture, for this transition from solitary to social, because this species is solitary and eusocial at the same time, or in different populations. Now, this is based upon former work of colleague Brian Danforth's. In the USA, where the species is also found, we have here, distribution of the species. It's found throughout the USA. And what we have on the left is a phylogeny, intraspecific phylogeny. And we have, you'll see in the USA, some black ones and some grey ones that are closely linked together. So the black are the social, and the blue, in that blue circle, are the solitary individuals. But if we look where they are geographically, there's Colorado and Montana. There's two individuals that are geographically 1,000 kilometres apart. I don't know how far it is. 1,000 kilometres, it's a long distance apart. But phylogenetically, so genetically, extremely close. And if we look at this population here, which is at Greenwood Spring in Colorado, it's geographically really close, but it's social, not solitary. It's genetically very far apart. So what seems to be the case in the USA is all the social ones are genetically very close, and all the solitary ones are genetically very close to each other, but they're distant from one another. So the suggestion from this is that there's a genetic basis to sociality, that genes underpin behaviour and social behaviour. In green at the bottom are the European bees, bit unclear where they lie. So the question we've asked is there a genetic basis to sociality, that transition? What do we mean by solitary and eusocial? Well, solitary means queen, overwintering queen, produces offspring, and those offspring mate, and then they overwinter again. Eusocial means queen overwinters, produces a few workers, and then the colony of queen and a few workers produce the new sexuals. And you say, well, that's miles away from the honeybee. Indeed it is. But the honeybee has gone through this transition from solitary to eusocial about 80 million years ago, or sometime around about then. So it's a very simple, it seems like a maybe not so complicated transition, but it does entail some individuals actually foregoing reproduction, emerging and saying, hang on, I'm not going to go into winter sleep. I'm actually going to start helping mum, which is a major behavioural and physiological difference compared with the solitary. And this is the life cycle that bumblebees show and social wasps show and such like as well. Now then, what do we find in Britain and Ireland? Well, generally northern populations in blue tend to be are solitary, and southern populations in red tend to be social, except that population down here in Dorset, which is at relatively high altitude, and they tend to be solitary as well. In terms of genetic differences, I'm not going to explain the details of this, but the Irish ones are all very similar to one another. They all form one colour in this clustering, and the British ones all form another colour. So Britain are very similar, the British bees are very similar, the Irish bees are very similar to each other, but different from one another. And if you notice, oh, that means the Irish bees, blue and red, are similar, and the British bees, blue and red, are similar. So it doesn't look as though genes play a role here in this transition. Genes seem not to be important. So it seems like environment plays a role. When it's cold and wet, they're solitary. So we went out to test this from our locations, and here are three of the locations where we worked: Belfast, Murlock, Clara Bridge, there in just south of Dublin. That gives you an idea of where this thing is nesting. It's nesting in the ground. So what do you do if you have a hypothesis? You run an experiment. And here's our experimental evolution. So we moved bees from both southern populations, eusocial populations, and solitary populations up north to Peebles to see what they would do, because Peebles is a northern site where it's solitary. And what happened? Well, we marked them, we studied them, and all of them became solitary. So even the eusocial ones from the south all became solitary. Maybe that's easy to conceive. What happens in the reverse? If we take them from solitary population, where they've only ever experienced cold climates, and move them down to a warm climate? Well, this entailed me digging holes in the ground in Lady Dixon Park, so I'd like to thank Belfast Parks and Amenity because they were very, very helpful and were quite happy for me to do whatever I wanted to do there. And then moving buckets of bees in soil down to Sussex, and then we watched their behaviour. And many of them became social. And we genotyped their offspring to see whether it was the mum who had been producing these offspring or one of her workers, so really not workers. And what we found is, maybe it's a bit difficult to see in this, but here are the nests at the bottom, and here the offspring genotyped. In black means single female produced offspring, white means a second female produced offspring. And generally, when the mum was present, they were eusocial. So there we've got Belfast bees, solitary bees, living at Sussex University, or not far from Sussex University, and they become eusocial, or at least 46% of the bees became eusocial. So purely environment, not genes in this case. So it seems, at least in Britain, it's socially plastic. What it is in the States is difficult to know. The suggestion from the genetic data is that it's genetic underpinning, but that's not been tested. So I think Nietzsche might be happy that at least in Europe we have social plasticity, whereas it seems for this species in the States, the suggestion only, but only the suggestion of the genetic data, indirect, is that it's genes that underpin behaviour. We can't be sure. Certainly from the experiments we can be sure the behaviour is plastic. So again, reiterating, nature versus nurture. Yes, there may be genes that underpin behaviour, but environment plays a big role as well. So, I've now addressed this transition from solitary to eusocial, but simply through to a primitively eusocial life cycle. That is like in the bumblebee or the social wasp, and that's presumably what the ancestral honeybee also had behaved as, sometime about 80 million years ago. Subsequent to that, more recently, it must have evolved its higher eusocial behaviour. And there we're a little bit hazy about dating. They were a little bit, it's more difficult to date. What we can say quite clearly is that the honeybee, at least the honeybee, is closely related to orchid bees, which are found only in the neotropics, which tend to be solitary, and it's more distantly related to bumblebees and stingless bees. Bumblebees being so-called primitively eusocial, this with overwintering queens, stingless bees being very much like honeybees with perennial colonies. So we can see, so something like about 80 or less million years ago, a lineage has broken off here to form the honeybees, and then from that, one lineage has formed the honeybees and the other has become solitary, the orchid bees. Well, they look completely different from honeybees. Such is the way. So, but the dating of that is a little bit hazy. Now I'd like to talk further about just the true honeybee species. Those are the species that are within the genus Apis. And not only at the honeybee species, but also at subspecies within Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, which is the species that we deal with, we work with. The individual that's been inspirational in pushing forward the study of the honeybee and honeybee species is this person, Ruttner, and probably some of you will be familiar with the book Biogeography and Taxonomy of Honeybees, although largely based upon morphometric characters. The book, nonetheless, so it may have been superseded now by a lot of genetic data, nonetheless, he has been inspirational. And one of his PhD students is Robin Moritz, who is my colleague at Halle University. And he, a PhD student of Ruttner's, has really taken up that mantle and has done most, he and his students, I think, have done most to understand the diversity of Apis and the diversity within Apis mellifera, our western honeybee, from a genetic perspective. So let's look at Ruttner's, one of Ruttner's old figures. Here we've got the old world showing the distribution of the honeybee, Apis mellifera, and the distribution of the other Apis species. How do they relate with one another? Well, first of all, let me give you a few pictures about what these other apis species look like. And we think there are probably 9 of them. First of all, there's a couple of mini bees, mini honeybees, that are very beautiful, but they live on a single comb, a single open comb like this. Relatively small species, harvested, and this is from a colleague in Thailand, harvested and sold in markets, or at least the honey and the brood is. Then we have a series of species, 2 or 3 species of giant honeybee that nest in these up underneath trees as a single comb, and on that comb one finds thousands of bees. There's 3 or 4 bee depth of bees covering that comb. Again, sold, combs harvested and sold. And then in Asia we also have 4 species of hive bee, or 4 species of bee, which, like Apis mellifera, produce multiple combs together and are nesting usually in cavities. Apis cerana is the best known of those, kept and used for beekeeping. This is a picture of mine from Bangladesh. But they have parallel sodid combs and look remarkably similar to Apis mellifera. What's the relationships amongst those? Well, DNA sequence data has shown quite clearly that ancestrally are these mini bees, Apis florea, with a single comb. And dating shows they are about the last common ancestor between the honeybee, which I've got up here, and these little bees is about 10 to 12 million years ago. Notice, though, they're all highly eusocial already. So primitively eusocial is gone. They're all down that road of eusociality, highly complex societies. Next, we've got a split here between the big bees, the giant bees that nest in Asia underneath trees and such like, and the others, which are Apis mellifera, the western bee, Apis cerana, and its related species, the cavity nesting multi-comb species, and then a split here between Apis mellifera and the other Asiatic species. So that's fairly clear phylogeny. Can the fossils, that's based upon DNA sequence data, can the fossils tell us anything? Well, there's one place that's generated a lot of honeybee fossils by the name of Randecker Maar. It's in southwest Germany, in the Swabian Alp, and I've had the good fortune to visit it. It's a beautiful site, and if ever you get the opportunity and you'd like to look for a couple of fossils of honeybees, I can highly recommend a little restaurant, the only restaurant in the neighbouring village, that does Zwiebel roast braten, which is roast beef with onions. It's really good. So, we've got Randecker Maar. It's an old volcano, and there are deposits there from about 15 million years ago in the Miocene. Excellent deposits of insects, including a lot of honeybees. This is the so-called holotype, Apis armbrister, and it looks very much like Apis mellifera from that deposit. There are lots of others from there, and they've been systematically screened by Michael Engel, he's probably the most famous, and his colleagues here. And they've put together, this is not a phylogeny, this is a tree of similarity in morphology, so it's a bit difficult to interpret. But what we have is modern honeybees here, Apis mellifera, modern little bees, Apis florea, modern dorsata, big giant honeybees there, and then the bees from those fossil records. And they lie around there, which ain't very useful actually, because those fossils, basically what they say is, well, some of them look a bit like modern honeybees, some of them look a bit like modern Apis dorsata, and actually the paper concludes we can't really be sure what they are, whether it was one very variable species or whether we had 2 or more species there. So the fossil record actually in the case of the honeybee isn't very useful. We can't even say whether they are an ancestor of Apis mellifera. It may well have been another side branch, independent of Apis mellifera. So fossils aren't going to be much use. But at least what we can say, based upon this phylogeny, is that, and it is a relatively well-supported, it's a very well-supported phylogeny, at least we can say something about within these eusocial species where dance language evolved, multicombs evolved. So dance language in particular is something that's very particular to the honeybee and to all honeybee species, they have this wonderful waggle dance. And I've taken this from Tom Seeley's book. It communicates, this waggle dance, this buzzing waggle dance, communicates the direction and distance here, encoded direction and distance of food sources from the hive, that they communicate to other nest members. And it's a really special trait that the honeybee has, but it's a special trait that all honeybees have. And what we can say then is that dance language must have evolved, if we don't know, from 80 million years, if we've got this time frame, 80 million years primitively eusocial, through to about 12 million years last common ancestor. Some point there, all these species have evolved the dance language. They all dance. This one species has a silent dance. So probably the first dance languages weren't bzzd, bzzd, but they were, I'm not going to repeat this, but tail stuck up, buzz, visual dance. Subsequently, these individuals have evolved a buzzing dance. And of course, it's important to have a buzzing dance if you're buzzing in the dark, as they do in hives, because you ain't going to communicate very well visually inside the middle of a hive. So sometime back, and again, difficult to date, but we probably would say then if this is a 12 million year split, that could be, say, 10 million or so years ago, that they've evolved a dance which encodes a buzz as well. Now, just a word about nature versus nurture again. You'll say, OK, good, so we've got the honeybee and it's genetically like that. Apis mellifera and Apis cerana is genetically like that, and they're all very different. Actually, there is an element of environment there as well, because it is possible to, and it has been done. Apis cerana has been taken into Apis mellifera hives, allowed to emerge there. And what do? They behave like honeybees. They carry on living. So you can get the two species living together. I think the reverse doesn't go. I dread to think what pathogens and parasites are mixed by doing such experiments. But anyhow, they have been undertaken. So clearly, part of the differences amongst these species is genes. But there's also a strong environmental component as well. OK, let's go back and finally look at Apis mellifera itself and its subspecies. And this is Rutner's diagram again of the distribution, the natural distribution of Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, the one that's used mostly by beekeeping, the one that we use. And he's got another image in his book of post-glacial spread of different races of honeybees out of glacial refugia. If we think back a bit further, we've got some hypotheses about how Apis mellifera evolved and dispersed. There's this hypothesis that was put forward by Rutner, actually based upon morphology, that maybe the honeybee Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, arose somewhere in Asia and spread out into Europe and into Africa. An alternative view, northern distribution seems unlikely. An alternative view, I'll put more strongly, a third view, that maybe Africa is the source of the honeybee and it's spread from there outwards. And there's been a very influential paper came out in 2006 by Charlie Whitfield at I think it's Illinois State University, in which he didn't genotype lots of honeybees, but he looked at so-called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Basically, he looked across the whole genome, at variability across the whole genome of hundreds of individuals of honeybees from around its natural distribution. And what we see in the colour patterns, you can see those individuals that are genetically similar. And Africa has these pink ones, so they're all very similar. Spain and Northern Europe has these black ones, all relatively similar. The yellow ones are in Italy, and the blue ones, and east coast of what we call Carnica. And over in the east, in Turkey, are the blue ones. Actually, 4 lineages, not 3. Already there's a hint. Quite a lot of diversity in Asia. And this is a tree based upon these data, suggesting, and you might say this is rather arcane, that the root of the tree, where it originated, is somewhere within the pink ones in Africa. So that's a very influential paper from 2006, suggesting out of Africa, like humans. It's associated with, at least in European populations, there's about of the 10,000 or so known genes in the honeybee, about 1,000 of them seem to have been under selection and seem to have changed in that move from Africa to into Europe. More recently, a colleague, Matt Webster at Uppsala, has reanalyzed those data and also generated new data and said, hang on guys, you're a bit too quick there. If we look in more detail, and these are a couple of what I find very difficult to interpret trees, so I'm not sure how you're going to cope with it. But what we've got here is the same data set, blues and yellows and pinks like before. But what we find is that the outgroup, actually it isn't in Africa, it's somewhere over here somewhere. So he said, hang on guys, you've been too quick. If we reanalyze the data and we add new data to it, actually it doesn't seem as though it's an out of Africa story at all. Certainly what we can say is Apis mellifera, the subspecies that we have that's native here, is either associated with Africa or actually derived from African, Iberiensis and mellifera. So that certainly seems to be the case. But as to whether the origin, and if we look within Spain, for example, we see darker colours of the African haplotypes and light colours of the mellifera, more European haplotypes. We see a good gradation across Spain, and it's probably the country that's been studied best in terms of its population genetics. So we can see, yes, okay, there is African origin, or at least African, or at least associated with what's found in North Africa, lineages there. But in terms of this pattern about the M lineage coming up from Africa and the C lineage from Europe, well, from the Near East, well, actually, that's probably a bit of a misnomer, and this is 2009, because actually there's far greater diversity here. And the out of Africa story doesn't seem to hold, at least the evidence is not there. So coming back to the original hypotheses, where does Apis mellifera and all its subspecies come from? Well, Matt Webster and colleagues have suggested, actually, the data don't suggest an out of Africa. That's a misanalysis, if you like, or of the 2006 data. And this hypothesis also, that the Apis mellifera, our subspecies, has come somehow through Asia, also doesn't seem to be supported. More likely, then, it is that the origin of the honeybee that we use, Apis mellifera, is in the Near East somewhere, in Asia. And indeed, that's where there is the greatest diversity, genetic diversity, or great genetic diversity of lineages of so-called this C and O, the continental and oriental honeybees. And from there, the honeybee, Apis mellifera, has spread into Africa and done exceedingly well there, and spread probably through Africa into Spain and France and into Britain as well. And that, at least that spread, clearly the most recent spread would have been post-glacial, which is about the last 10,000 years. Okay, so a little bit of a change of where we think honeybees have come from. So, in short, so in summary, we've got honeybees, eusocial for the past 80 million years, undoubtedly of Asiatic origin. Indeed, there are big genetic differences between species and subspecies, but one should not underplay the role that environment also makes in shaping behaviour. And next time you enter one of your pugnacious hives, don't necessarily blame the genes, because they are not the only factor that play a role. So finally, I'd like to thank people that have funded at least the sweat bee work, and also colleagues that have been involved with me on the sweat bee work. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
The population in Libya, in Kufra, out in the desert, should then be quite close to mellifera. Have they looked at that? If your theory of the movement go back, yeah. No, stop. You've gone
You're suggesting that those bees in North Africa should be quite similar to the bees that we have here.
Yeah.
I don't think they've sampled across here, but the sampling has been done in Morocco here, and you can see it's sort of pinks and blacks, and here we've got lots of blacks. Yeah. So the pinks and the blacks, pinks relate to, it's not just a single variable, it's related to hundreds of different so-called SNP markers, and the blacks relate to another suite of markers. So yes, you can see the gradation here in West Europe goes over into North Africa, most certainly. There's no sampling there. I mean, it's not a very good figure in that sense.
Moritz has been in Kufra, in Libya, and sampled there. So you should find, surely, that they would be similar if your theory is right.
I would guess so. I'm not sure whether they have sampled in Libya. I don't think Charlie Whitfield has sampled in Libya.
Okay.
Rather, it's focused on specific races. So he's focused on Egypt, further south, and you probably can't see the lines here, but these yellow ones all relate to Italy, the Italian peninsula. And these all relate to Carnica, so Slovenia, this area. And the blue ones all relate to Anatolia and the Near East. Yeah.
Okay.
So sampling hasn't been done, can't say, but I would have thought the same as well, actually, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Taking your comments about the variation of nature and nurture, does that imply that if we import Ligustica or Carnica, they're likely to revert to a mellifera type if they tried to put them in UK hives?
Interesting. You know, I don't know. Clearly, those traits that we're interested in, the behaviour, the physiology and such like, there's a strong genetic component to them, but there's also an environmental component. Having worked in Cardiff with black bees and with yellow bees, I would have said there's quite a strong genetic basis to that trait of defence. And we already know that, and work in the US has shown, particularly with Africanized bees and European bees, there's a strong genetic basis to that trait. What we don't know is about the traits related to other factors, like, for example, beekeepers often talk about winter build-up post-winter, and the Carnica builds up quickly, and the mellifera builds up slowly, and such like. So those sorts of traits, those complex traits, we don't really have much of a handle on. You know, I show this and say, yo, great, there's some genetic differences, but how do those genetic differences map onto things that we're interested in, behavioural traits or physiological traits? And they haven't done that yet. I mean, potentially it's possible to do it. Clearly, though, yes, environment's going to play a role. So if you have that same Ligustica colony in Italy and that Ligustica colony in Cardiff, it's going to behave differently. Yes, simply because of the environment. Of course it will. You know, it's almost noddy, but we should understand both play a role in determining the phenotype. And I think that's an important message that I want to get across there. I think genes do play an important role. Genes are of importance, and it's staggering to see how much genetic differences there are, actually, despite a lot of beekeeping. It might say something about the impact of beekeeping or the lack of impact that beekeeping has had, at least in some locations. Clearly, the sampling has been done. In this case, the sampling was done to try and focus on what were considered to be pure races. So it's not really reflective of what's in the environment, and it might be more. I think the evidence actually suggests that it's more heterogeneous, actually, so there is some impact of beekeeping.
Europe's warmed up, I think, 2 degrees in the last 50 years, and there's been a lot of insects, new insects have expanded their range hugely. Do you see an increase in, I think if I've followed it correctly, sociality in your sweat bees over the last 50 years, which effectively matches the increase in temperature?
Yeah. I can't tell in Ireland, we can see that the threshold must be around Dublin or north of Dublin, somewhere between Dublin and Belfast. God, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? It's very political. And there's a change as you go north.
Oh, there is.
And people from Cork here will say, yeah, we know that. Yes. So where that threshold point is may well have moved north. I can imagine it might have. You're right, we have had species that have invaded Britain, for example, a bumblebee species, Bombus hypnorum, 2 wasp species, Doligovespula media and Saxonica, Doligovespula saxonica, or is it Vespula or Doligovespula? I can't remember which of the subject. But those so we've got 3 social species that are invaded, but we have other solitary species. So it would be interesting to study, and I think it's... I'm not sure whether we've got good enough data. For the rubicundus work, Halictus rubicundus, it takes a lot of time to know how one population behaves. Because you have to mark the individuals, mark the nests, go back, and we have to go back week on week to see, is she still there? Has she got workers? Are the workers really working, or are they just going off into hibernate? So to get a handle on social behaviour and to define the social phenotype at any one location has actually taken us a lot of time. And I don't think that's been done, 50 years ago. Nobody's really paid attention. So in terms of that one species, I can't answer, but in terms of the community, it should theoretically be possible. That would, of course, be overlaid by any habitat degradation, fragmentation, intensification of agriculture, which has led to loss of species. So we've got on the one side a warmer climate, things coming in, but at the same time, things being lost as well. That's a complex one to tease apart. But in principle, it should be possible to find that. Not sure it's been done, though.
I'm just wondering, like, as in with Neanderthal and Homo sapien, how much interbreeding there is between all the species?
Nowadays, those apis species seem to be good, clear species. There's no interbreeding going on there, even though they may use the same pheromones to communicate, which is surprising. So the pheromones that they use in alarm, or the queen uses, is the same across species, or it's not so different across species. So there's a lot of similarity and use of the same chemicals. There doesn't seem to be any interbreeding, and I think experiments have been undertaken in the 70s to try and cross, I think, Serrana with mellifera, which is the closest, and I think some instrumental insemination was undertaken. Nothing ever succeeded. So they are nowadays good species.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paxton.
Pleasure.